The laughter echoed across Greenwood Park as families enjoyed the warm afternoon, but an air of tension was building beneath the idyllic scene. 8-year-old Sophie Daniels darted across the field, her bright yellow kite dancing in the breeze. Her father, Ethan, a respected judge, watched her with pride, unaware that their peaceful day was about to be shattered. On the park's edge, Officer Logan Price stepped out of his patrol car, his gaze locking onto Sophie. To Logan, her energetic movements seemed chaotic, even suspicious. A snap judgment shaped by years of unchecked bias. His hand hovered near his holster, the weight of his authority pressing heavily on his every decision. "Stop, right there!" Logan's sharp command pierced the air, silencing the chatter and laughter around him. Sophie froze, her kite string slipping from her fingers as confusion and fear filled her innocent eyes. Ethan stood, his instincts as a father kicking in. "Officer, what are you doing?" "She's just a child," he called out, his voice firm but edged with rising panic. The crack of a gunshot ripped through the tranquility, turning a serene park into a scene of chaos. Sophie fell to the ground, her cries of pain echoing through the stunned silence as blood began to stain her jeans. Before we dive into this gripping story of heartbreak, injustice, and resilience, comment below where you're watching from today. And if you're already drawn into Sophie's incredible journey, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss another powerful story like this. The golden rays of the sun pierced through the dense canopy of oak trees, scattering intricate patterns of light on the pathways of Greenwood Park. The gentle hum of conversations and children's laughter filled the air, merging into a symphony of life and peace. Among the families enjoying the vibrant weekend atmosphere were Ethan Daniels and his lively 8-year-old daughter, Sophie Daniels. Sophie was a spirited girl whose laughter could light up any room. Her rich, caramel-toned skin glowed under the sunlight, complementing her radiant smile. Clad in a bright yellow dress that matched her sunny disposition, she ran ahead of her father, clutching the string of her favorite kite. The vibrant kite danced in the sky, its golden tail a streak of joy against the azure canvas. Ethan, a tall man with a composed demeanor, watched his daughter with a mixture of pride and affection. A prominent judge known for his integrity, he was no stranger to the weight of responsibility and the world's harsh realities. Yet here, in the sanctuary of Greenwood Park, he was simply a father cherishing his time with his child. Today was a rare day of relaxation for Ethan. His impeccably tailored suit had been replaced by a casual button-down shirt and dark slacks, still polished but less formal. The park had always been their retreat, a place to escape the pressures of his high-profile career and for Sophie to indulge in the simple joys of childhood. "Dad, look, it's flying higher than ever." Sophie's voice rang out excitedly as she pointed at the kite soaring above the trees. Ethan chuckled, closing the novel he had been reading. "That's because you're getting better at controlling it, Sophie. You've got the touch of a pro kite flyer now." Sophie beamed at the praise, her eyes sparkling with joy. "One day, I'll teach you how to fly it this well, Dad," she declared confidently, before darting to chase after the kite as it dipped and swirled with the breeze. The park was alive with similar moments of happiness, families enjoying picnics, couples walking hand in hand, and children playing on swings and slides. It was a scene of idyllic harmony, starkly contrasting Ethan's struggles and conflicts in the courtroom. As Sophie's kite dipped low, she laughed and zigzagged across the field to catch it, her energy seemingly boundless. Ethan smiled faintly, savoring the rare sense of calm. He leaned back on the bench, allowing himself momentarily absorbed in his book. The world around him faded as the pages drew him into another reality. But while Ethan was immersed in the fictional world, a police cruiser pulled up on the park's perimeter, its presence unassuming to most. Stepping out was Officer Logan Price, a tall and broad-shouldered man in his early 40s. Logan's uniform was pristine, his badge gleaming in the sunlight. Yet behind the polished exterior lay years of unchecked bias and authority. Logan scanned the park with a detached gaze, his expression impassive but observant. He had spent over a decade on the force, and his instincts, often shaped more by prejudice than reason, guided his actions. His eyes settled on Sophie, her exuberance catching his attention. "Bookmark?" To Logan, Sophie's lively movements appeared erratic, even suspicious. The carefree abandon with which she chased her kite was something he couldn't reconcile with his narrow perspective. A fleeting thought crossed his mind, a misplaced sense of vigilance that misread innocence as disorder. As Sophie darted across the field, Logan's hand instinctively rested on his holster, a habit born of years of tension and fear. His eyes narrowed as he followed her movements. In his mind, she didn't belong in the idyllic scene he had constructed in his head. Unaware of the officer's gaze, Sophie giggled as the kite danced higher. Her bright laughter resonated through the park, drawing smiles from nearby families. Ethan, sensing a change in the atmosphere, glanced up and spotted Logan standing near the edge of the field. Logan's rigid posture and focused stare immediately put Ethan on alert. Years of navigating social and racial dynamics had sharpened Ethan's instincts for trouble. He closed his book and rose from the bench, his attention now fully on Sophie. "Sophie, stay close," Ethan called out, his voice steady but carrying an undertone of urgency. Sophie turned briefly, her face lighting up at the sight of her father, before resuming her chase of the kite. The world seemed perfectly normal to her, free of the tensions that Ethan had begun to perceive. Logan, meanwhile, took a step closer to the field. His movements were deliberate, almost calculated. Ethan's heart rate quickened as he noticed Logan's hand hovering near his holster. A chilling thought crossed his mind. Something was about to go terribly wrong. The serene atmosphere of the park hung in delicate balance, teetering on the edge of disruption. Ethan's voice grew firmer. "Sophie, come back here now." The words reached Sophie, but before she could react, Logan's voice cut through the air, sharp and commanding. "Stop right there." The joyous sounds of the park began to fade as tension crept into the air. Logan's shout drew the attention of nearby parkgoers, their conversations halting as they turned to see what was happening. Sophie froze, the kite string slipping from her fingers. Her wide, innocent eyes locked onto Logan as he began to approach her, his expression unreadable but his stance imposing. Ethan's protective instincts surged, and he moved swiftly towards Sophie. His voice trembled with a mix of fear and authority. "Officer, what's going on? That's my daughter." Logan hesitated for a fraction of a second, but the prejudices ingrained in him over the years clouded his judgment. His grip on his holster tightened, and at that moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The peaceful sanctuary of Greenwood Park had become a stage for an impending tragedy, one that would shatter lives and ignite a storm of outrage. The stillness in Greenwood Park was deceptive, masking the brewing storm as Officer Logan Price advanced toward Sophie. She stood frozen in confusion, her small hands trembling at her sides. Around them, the hum of the park began to fade as onlookers sensed the tension escalating. Ethan Daniels quickened his pace, his heart pounding as he closed the distance between himself and his daughter. His voice carried the urgency of a father's fear. "Officer, please, there's no issue here. She's just a child playing." Logan barely acknowledged Ethan, his focus locked on Sophie. His mind raced with thoughts shaped by years of distorted instincts. To him, her sudden darting movements were erratic and unpredictable. It didn't matter that she was holding nothing more than the string of a kite. "Stay back," Logan barked, his voice sharp and commanding. His hand remained on his holster as though any moment could spiral into chaos. Ethan stopped in his tracks, his hands raised in an instinctive gesture of compliance. Despite the fear gripping him, his voice remained steady. "She's my daughter," he said firmly. "Her name is Sophie, and she's 8 years old. Please, just let me take her home." But Logan's mind was already clouded with judgment, and the simplicity of the scene, an innocent child playing in a public park, was lost on him. Every muscle in his body was taut, ready to act on a threat that didn't exist. Sophie, still clutching the kite string, took a hesitant step backward. Her voice wavered as she called out, "Daddy?" The single word broke something in Ethan, but before he could respond, the unthinkable happened. In a flash of motion, Logan drew his weapon. His voice boomed across the field. "Stop moving! Put your hands where I can see them." The commotion froze the park. Parents shielded their children, and murmurs of disbelief rippled through the gathering crowd. Ethan's heart stopped as he saw the barrel of the gun pointed at his little girl. "No!" Ethan shouted, surging forward instinctively, but it was too late. The deafening crack of the gunshot shattered the still air. Sophie crumpled to the ground, clutching her leg as a scream tore from her small body. The vibrant yellow kite slipped from her hands and fluttered downward, landing on the grass like a forgotten dream. For a moment, time stood still. The world seemed to hold its breath as the reality of what had just occurred sank in. Then, chaos erupted. Ethan was at Sophie's side in an instant, his hands trembling as he gently cradled her injured leg. Blood seeped through her jeans, staining his hands as he pressed them against the wound in a desperate attempt to stem the flow. "Sophie, stay with me, baby," he whispered, his voice breaking as tears streamed down his face. Sophie's sobs were a mixture of pain and terror. "Daddy, it hurts," she whimpered, her tiny fingers gripping his arm with surprising strength. Ethan's fury surged as he looked up at Logan, who stood frozen, his gun still in his hand. The officer's face was pale, his eyes wide with the dawning realization of what he had done. But instead of rushing to help, Logan's expression hardened, his training urging him to maintain control, even as the situation spiraled out of it. "This is a police matter. Everyone, step back," Logan barked, his voice gruff but unsteady. The crowd didn't budge. Their shock gave way to outrage as voices rose in protest. "You shot a child," someone shouted, their words cutting through the din like a blade. "What kind of monster are you?" another voice echoed. Logan's grip on his gun faltered and he holstered it with shaky hands. The weight of what he had done pressed down on him like a physical force, but his pride wouldn't let him admit fault. Ethan rose slowly, his hands stained with Sophie's blood, his face a storm of grief and fury. He locked eyes with Logan, his voice cold and deliberate. "Do you even understand what you've done?" Logan opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. His silence was damning. The sound of approaching sirens grew louder, mingling with the cries of the crowd and Sophie's soft whimpers. Paramedics rushed to the scene, their movements efficient as they assessed Sophie's injury and prepared to transport her to the hospital. "I'm going with her," Ethan said, his tone leaving no room for argument. One of the paramedics nodded and Ethan climbed into the ambulance, never once letting go of Sophie's hand. Before the doors closed, he cast one last look at Logan, his eyes filled with a silent promise: this isn't over. As the ambulance sped away, Logan was left standing in the chaos he had created. His commanding officer, Captain Marcus Reed, arrived moments later, his face etched with anger. "What the hell happened here, Price?" Reed demanded, his voice low but sharp. Logan stammered, his words tumbling out in fragments. She looked suspicious. You thought? Reed cut him off, his glare icy. "You shot an unarmed child, Price? Do you have any idea what you've done to her, to this department?" The crowd's outrage continued to grow, their voices demanding justice for Sophie. Phones were recorded every moment, ensuring that this incident would not be forgotten. Logan felt the walls closing in, the weight of his actions crashing down on him. He had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, and the consequences were only beginning. The sterile hum of the hospital corridors filled the air, a sharp contrast to the chaos Ethan Daniels had left behind at the park. Sitting outside the operating room, his hands clenched into fists, Ethan's mind replayed the horrifying scene over and over. The crack of the gunshot, Sophie's scream, the sight of her small body collapsing to the ground. He wanted to scream, to let out the fury boiling within him, but he knew that wouldn't help Sophie. For now, all he could do was wait. The seconds stretched into minutes, each one intensifying the ache in his chest. Ethan paced the floor, stopping occasionally to glance at the double doors that separated him from his daughter. He couldn't shake the image of her trembling hands clutching his arm as blood pooled beneath her. A father's worst nightmare had unfolded before his eyes, and it wasn't an accident. It was a direct result of ignorance, bias, and a system that had failed countless times before. Finally, the doors opened and a surgeon stepped out, his face lined with exhaustion but calm. Ethan approached him, his eyes burning with desperation. "How is she?" Ethan's voice was hoarse, a mixture of fear and hope. The surgeon offered a small, weary smile. "The bullet missed any major arteries. She's stable and should make a full recovery with time and therapy, but the damage to her leg will require significant rehabilitation." Relief flooded Ethan's body, but it was fleeting. While Sophie's physical wounds could heal, he knew the psychological scars on her and on their family would linger much longer. "Can I see her?" he asked. The surgeon nodded. "She's in recovery now. She'll be groggy, but she's asking for you." Ethan pushed through the recovery room doors and saw Sophie lying on the bed, her small frame swaddled in white sheets. Her usually bright face was pale, and her eyes fluttered open as she heard his footsteps. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice weak but steady. Ethan knelt beside her, his large hand enveloping her smaller one. "I'm here, sweetheart. I'll always be here." As Sophie drifted back into a fitful sleep, Ethan made a silent vow. He would fight for justice, not just for Sophie, but for every child, every person who had been harmed by the prejudices that plagued the system. Meanwhile, across town, at the police precinct, Officer Logan Price sat in an interrogation room. The air was thick with tension as Captain Marcus Reed entered, his expression dark and unreadable. Logan sat slumped at the table, a stark contrast to his usual commanding demeanor. "You've made a mess, Price," Reed said, his voice low and cold. "This is going to cost us all." Logan avoided his captain's glare, his fingers fidgeting on the table. It was a split-second decision. "She moved so quickly. You thought wrong," Reed snapped, slamming his hands on the table. "She was a child, Logan. Unarmed, harmless. You shot her in front of witnesses. Do you understand what this means? The department is already under fire for misconduct cases, and now this?" Logan's silence was deafening. He knew he had no real defense. His years of unchecked authority had conditioned him to act without second-guessing, but this time, there was no justification that could shield him. Reed leaned closer, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "And her father? Ethan Daniels? He's not just any parent, he's a judge and a damn powerful one. He's coming for you and for us." Logan's face paled further. He had seen Ethan's fury firsthand, and now he was beginning to grasp the magnitude of the storm he had unleashed. Back at the hospital, news of the shooting spread like wildfire. Videos recorded by park-goers went viral, showing the moment Logan Price fired his weapon and the chaotic aftermath. Social media erupted in outrage, with hashtags like "Justice for Sophie" and "End Police Bias" trending within hours. Outside the hospital, a small group of protesters began to gather, their signs demanding accountability. "Justice for Sophie," they chanted, their voices rising in unison. Inside, Ethan sat by Sophie's bedside, his phone buzzing relentlessly with calls and messages. Reporters, civil rights organizations, and colleagues all reached out, offering support or seeking statements. Ethan ignored most of them, focusing instead on Sophie's slow, rhythmic breathing. One call, however, caught his attention. It was from Clara Knight, a close friend from law school and now a prominent civil rights attorney. "Ethan," her voice was steady but filled with emotion. "I saw the news. I'm so sorry. Whatever you need, I'm here." Ethan's response was firm, his anger sharpening into resolve. "I need justice, Clara. Not just for Sophie, but for everyone who's suffered like this. This can't happen again." "Then let's make it happen," Clara said. "We'll hold him accountable, not just Logan Price, but the system that allowed this to happen." Their conversation marked the beginning of a fight far larger than Ethan had anticipated. This wasn't just about his daughter. It was about confronting a culture of prejudice and impunity. As the hours passed, the protests outside the hospital grew larger. Families, activists, and concerned citizens joined the movement, carrying signs that read, "Protect our children and end systemic racism." Their voices grew louder, echoing through the streets and demanding justice. Inside the precinct, Captain Reed watched news coverage of the protests, his jaw tightening. The department had faced scrutiny before, but this was different. The footage of Sophie's shooting was undeniable, and public opinion was turning swiftly against them. He turned to his deputy, his voice tinged with frustration. "This isn't going away. We need to get ahead of it. Issue a statement, start an internal investigation, something to calm them down." But as Reed issued orders, Logan sat in silence, feeling the weight of his actions crushing him. The protesters' chants reached his ears, a constant reminder of the life he had shattered. For Ethan, the journey had only just begun. With Sophie resting and a growing community rallying behind him, he prepared for the battle ahead. This wasn't just about justice for Sophie. It was a fight to dismantle a system that had failed them all. The morning sun filtered through the hospital room's blinds, casting soft rays over Sophie's fragile frame. Ethan Daniels sat at her bedside, his eyes tired but alert. He hadn't left her side all night, his mind too consumed with anger and determination to find rest. Sophie stirred, her small voice cutting through the silence. "Daddy, am I going to be okay?" she asked, her big eyes searching his for reassurance. Ethan leaned forward, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You're going to be more than okay, sweetheart. I promise you that," he said firmly, though the weight of his words pressed heavily on his chest. Outside the hospital, the scene was far from peaceful. The protest that had started with a handful of people had grown into a full-blown demonstration. Hundreds of voices echoed through the streets demanding accountability. Signs bearing slogans like "Justice for Sophie" and "Stop Police Violence" filled the air with urgency and defiance. Ethan's phone buzzed incessantly with messages from journalists, activists, and concerned citizens. The case had become a lightning rod for national outrage, with news outlets running constant coverage of the shooting. Clips of Sophie playing with her kite, juxtaposed with footage of her being carried into an ambulance, fueled the public's fury. Amid the noise, Ethan found an ally in Clara Knight, his old friend and now his legal counsel. Clara had wasted no time assembling a team to begin building their case. "This is bigger than Sophie," Clara said during their first strategy meeting in the hospital cafeteria. Her tone was firm, her notepad already filled with scribbled notes. "This is about a system that allowed someone like Logan Price to carry a badge. We need to expose every failure, every blind eye turned." Ethan nodded, his face hard with resolve. "Then let's get to work." Across town, Officer Logan Price was facing his own reckoning. The precinct, once his safe haven, had become a place of isolation. His peers whispered about him in hushed tones, their glances filled with a mixture of pity and disdain. Even Captain Marcus Reed, who had initially been willing to shield him, was growing colder with every passing day. "We can't protect you from this," Reed had told him bluntly during a closed-door meeting. "The public wants blood, and they're not wrong to demand it. You brought this on yourself." Logan tried to defend himself, his voice cracking. "It was a split-second decision, Captain. I thought she was a threat." Reed interrupted, his voice dripping with disdain. "An 8-year-old girl with a kite? You didn't think, Logan. That's the problem, and now we're all paying for it." Logan left the office feeling hollow. The walls that had once seemed impenetrable now felt like they were closing in. Protesters had begun gathering outside his house, their chants relentless. Even his neighbors had turned cold, avoiding him in the streets. For the first time, Logan began to understand the gravity of his actions. But understanding offered little comfort. The damage was done, and the consequences were only beginning to unfold. Ethan and Clara worked tirelessly over the next few days, assembling evidence and speaking to witnesses. One such witness was a parkgoer who had captured the incident on video. The footage, shaky but clear, showed Sophie laughing and running with her kite moments before Logan fired his weapon. "This video is a game-changer," Clara said, her eyes fixed on the screen as they reviewed the footage in Ethan's temporary office at the hospital. "It's not just about what Logan did, it's about what he didn't do. No warnings, no de-escalation. He went straight for his gun." Ethan's jaw tightened as he watched the video for the third time. Each frame felt like a dagger to his heart, but it also strengthened his resolve. "This isn't just about Sophie," he said quietly. "This is about every family who's been through this and didn't have the platform to fight back. We're going to make sure they can't ignore this." The legal team began digging into Logan's past, uncovering a pattern of complaints filed against him. Allegations of racial bias and excessive force painted a damning picture, one that revealed a system more interested in protecting its officers than holding them accountable. Every complaint dismissed, Clara noted during one late-night meeting. "No investigations, no consequences. It's a pattern, Ethan, and we're going to expose it." Back at the precinct, not everyone was content to stay silent. Detective Maria Velasquez, a seasoned officer who had grown disillusioned with the department's culture, decided it was time to act. "I've seen too many cases like this buried," Maria said during a clandestine meeting with Clara and Ethan. Her voice was steady, but her frustration was palpable. The system is designed to protect people like Logan, not hold them accountable. But I'm done staying silent. I want to help. Maria handed over internal memos and reports that revealed a history of cover-ups and negligence within the department. It was a treasure trove of evidence, and Ethan couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope. "This is huge," Clara said as she sifted through the documents. "With Maria's testimony and these records, we can make this about more than Logan Price. We can put the entire system on trial." Ethan placed a hand on Maria's shoulder, his gratitude evident. "Thank you," he said simply. "You're risking a lot by coming forward." Maria nodded. "This isn't just about Sophie. It's about making sure no other kid has to go through this." As the days passed, the movement outside the hospital and the precinct gained momentum. What had started as a local protest had transformed into a national outcry. Celebrities and public figures voiced their support, while social media buzzed with calls for justice. Ethan stepped outside the hospital one evening, greeted by the sight of hundreds of people holding candles in a vigil for Sophie. The glow of the flames reflected the determination on their faces, and for the first time in days, Ethan felt the weight of the community's support. Standing on the hospital steps, he addressed the crowd, his voice carrying above the noise. "This fight isn't just for my daughter," he began, his tone steady but impassioned. "It's for every parent who's ever feared for their child's safety. It's for every community that's been ignored and silenced. We demand accountability, not just for one officer, but for a system that allows this to happen." The crowd erupted into cheers, their chants of justice for Sophie echoing into the night. Ethan felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just his fight anymore. It was a movement. The courthouse buzzed with reporters, activists, and concerned citizens as Ethan Daniels and Clara Knight made their first public steps toward justice. Cameras flashed, capturing every movement as Ethan stood in front of a sea of microphones. Beside him, Clara projected calm determination, her years of experience in civil rights cases evident in her composed demeanor. "This is not just a fight for my daughter Sophie," Ethan began, his voice steady despite the tumult around him. "This is a fight for every family that has been affected by bias and negligence in law enforcement. It's a fight to ensure that no child has to endure what Sophie has. We demand accountability, transparency, and reform." The crowd erupted in applause and chants of justice for Sophie. The press conference marked the official beginning of their legal battle, setting the stage for what would become a high-stakes confrontation with both Officer Logan Price and the system that had allowed his behavior to persist unchecked. Inside the precinct, Logan sat in a dimly lit conference room with his legal team. The tension in the room was palpable as his attorneys laid out their defense strategy. "They're going to paint you as a villain," one of his lawyers said bluntly. "Their goal is to make this about more than just you. They'll target the entire department, and you'll be the scapegoat." Logan shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "I made a split-second decision." "That's what we're trained to do," he muttered defensively. "Split-second or not, you shot an unarmed child," another lawyer countered. "That's what the public sees. That's what the jury will see." As the legal team debated strategies, Logan's mind drifted back to the incident at the park. He could still see Sophie's terrified face, the way she clutched her leg in pain. The memory gnawed at him, but he pushed it aside, clinging to the belief that he had acted out of caution, not malice. Ethan and Clara were deep in preparation, poring over every detail of the case. The video footage of the shooting was a centerpiece of their strategy, but Clara knew they needed more to dismantle the defense's argument. "They'll argue that Logan acted out of instinct," Clara said during a late-night meeting in Ethan's home. The dining table was covered with papers, reports, and witness statements. "We need to show that his instincts were rooted in bias, not legitimate fear." Ethan leaned forward, his jaw tightening. "What about his disciplinary record? The complaints filed against him?" Clara nodded. "We'll use it, but we need to frame it as part of a systemic failure. The department didn't just fail to hold him accountable. They enabled him." Their breakthrough came when Detective Maria Velasquez delivered another trove of internal documents. Among them were emails and memos that revealed a pattern of dismissing complaints against officers like Logan. "This is exactly what we need," Clara said, her eyes lighting up as she read through the files. It proves they've been sweeping issues under the rug for years. Ethan scanned the documents, his determination hardening. Then we make sure they can't hide it anymore. Meanwhile, the protests outside the precinct had grown larger and louder. What began as a local demonstration had become a national movement. News outlets covered the story relentlessly, turning Sophie into a symbol of the fight against systemic racism and police misconduct. Inside the precinct, tensions were boiling over. Officers who had once stood shoulder to shoulder now found themselves divided. Some quietly supported Logan, believing he was being unfairly targeted, while others distanced themselves entirely, unwilling to be associated with the controversy. Detective Velasquez bore the brunt of the hostility. Colleagues who had once trusted her now viewed her with suspicion. "You're either with us or against us," one officer snarled as she passed him in the hallway. Maria ignored the comment, her focus unwavering. She knew the risks of coming forward, but she also knew it was the right thing to do. The department's culture of silence had allowed too many injustices to go unchallenged, and she was determined to break that cycle. As the legal team prepared to file a civil lawsuit against Logan Price and the police department, the public outcry showed no signs of slowing down. Social media buzzed with hashtags like Justice for Sophie and #EndPoliceBias, and high-profile figures began lending their voices to the cause. One evening, as Ethan reviewed a draft of the lawsuit, his phone buzzed with a call from an unexpected number. "Judge Daniels?" The voice on the other end was firm but unfamiliar. "Yes, who's this?" "This is Detective Monica Ramirez," the caller said. "I've been following your case, and I want to help." Ethan hesitated for a moment. "Why?" "Because I've seen too many cases like this buried," Ramirez replied. "I know how the system works, and I know how they'll try to discredit you. But I also know where to find the skeletons they're hiding." Ethan glanced at Clara, who was listening intently. "We're interested," he said. "But this has to be airtight. No risks that could undermine the case." "Understood," Ramirez said. "I'll be in touch soon with what I've got." After ending the call, Clara looked at Ethan with cautious optimism. "This could be the edge we need," she said. As the protests continued to grow, Ethan stepped into a new role, not just as a father seeking justice, but as a leader in a larger movement. He appeared on talk shows and news panels, his eloquence and passion resonating with audiences across the country. "We're not just fighting for Sophie," he said during one interview. "We're fighting for a future where no child is seen as a threat because of the color of their skin. This isn't about revenge, it's about accountability and change." His words struck a chord, galvanizing supporters and putting even more pressure on the police department. Inside the precinct, Captain Marcus Reed watched the coverage with a sinking feeling. The walls were closing in, and he knew the department couldn't withstand the scrutiny much longer. "This is turning into a PR nightmare," he muttered to his deputy. "If we don't take action soon, we're all going down with him." But no amount of damage control could undo the harm already done. The stage was set for a battle that would test the limits of justice and the resilience of those fighting for it. The courthouse steps were bathed in the orange glow of the setting sun as Ethan Daniels and Clara Knight stood side by side, prepared to file their civil lawsuit. The weight of the moment wasn't lost on either of them. It wasn't just about Sophie. It was about dismantling the systems that had enabled Logan Price to act with impunity. "This is where the tide begins to turn," Clara said, her voice steady as she handed a thick folder of documents to the clerk. Ethan nodded, his gaze fixed on the courthouse doors. "We're not stopping until we see real accountability." The lawsuit named both Logan Price and the police department, accusing them of negligence and systemic bias. Within hours, the news broke, reigniting the already fiery public discourse. Headlines across the country highlighted the boldness of the move, framing it as a battle between a grieving father and an entrenched institution. At the precinct, tensions reached a breaking point. Captain Marcus Reed called a mandatory meeting, the room packed with officers whose faces were marked by a mixture of anger, fear, and frustration. "The Daniels lawsuit changes everything," Reed began, his tone clipped. "They're not just coming after Price, they're coming after all of us. Every decision we've made, every complaint we've ignored, it's all under scrutiny now." The room erupted in murmurs. Some officers expressed solidarity with Logan while others distanced themselves, unwilling to be implicated in the growing scandal. Logan sat at the back of the room, his posture slumped. The weight of his actions was finally catching up to him, and the isolation was suffocating. Even his closest allies had grown cold, their loyalty eroded by the damning evidence piling up against him. Meanwhile, Ethan and Clara's team began piecing together a strategy that would not only hold Logan accountable, but also expose the systemic failures that had shielded him for years. Detective Maria Velasquez played a pivotal role, providing insider knowledge and a trove of internal documents that painted a clear picture of the department's culture of silence. In one particularly damning memo, a senior officer had dismissed a complaint against Logan, citing a lack of evidence despite multiple eyewitness accounts. "This is exactly what we need," Clara said, her eyes narrowing as she read through the memo. "It's not just negligence, it's deliberate cover-up." Ethan leaned over her shoulder, his jaw tightening. "We need to make sure the jury sees every single failure. They need to understand this wasn't an accident. It was inevitable because of the system." As the legal team worked tirelessly, the protests outside the precinct grew more intense. What had started as a local movement now had national attention, with people traveling from across the country to join the demonstrations. Among the protesters was Danielle Torres, a college student and activist who had been following Sophie's story closely. She held a sign that read "Protect Our Children" and spoke passionately to anyone who would listen. "This isn't just about one child," Danielle said during an impromptu interview with a local news station. "It's about all of us. It's about creating a world where no parent has to fear for their child's safety because of the color of their skin." Her words went viral, further amplifying the movement and putting even more pressure on the police department to act. The turning point came when Detective Monica Ramirez, another insider at the precinct, reached out to Ethan's team. Unlike Maria Velasquez, who had already gone public with her testimony, Monica had remained in the shadows, wary of the repercussions. "I've been keeping records," Monica said during a late-night meeting with Clara and Ethan. Her voice was steady, but her hands betrayed her nervousness as she passed over a thick file. Clara opened the file, her eyes widening as she scanned the pages. This is incredible," she said, looking up at Monica. "These are internal investigations that were buried. Complaints, reports, even disciplinary hearings. This is the smoking gun we've been looking for." Ethan glanced at the documents, his expression a mix of gratitude and resolve. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I know how much you're risking by coming forward." Monica shook her head. "This isn't about me. It's about Sophie and every other kid who's been failed by this system." Logan Price, meanwhile, was finding it harder to maintain the facade of confidence. The protesters outside his home were relentless, their chants growing louder with each passing day. Even his family had left, unable to withstand the scrutiny and hostility directed their way. One evening, Logan received an envelope in his mailbox. Inside was a copy of one of the complaints filed against him years ago, dismissed without investigation. Scrawled across the document in red ink were the words, "You're not the victim." Logan stared at the paper, the words sinking in like a stone. For the first time, he began to question not just his actions at the park, but the years of decisions and behaviors that had led him to this point. As the trial date approached, Ethan and Clara intensified their preparations. The case had grown far beyond Sophie's injury. It was now a referendum on systemic racism and police misconduct. During a strategy session, Clara outlined their key arguments. "We'll start with Sophie's story," she said, gesturing to the timeline laid out on the table. Her innocence, the recklessness of Logan's actions, and the immediate harm caused. She moved to another section of the timeline. "Then we bring in the systemic failures, Logan's disciplinary record, the complaints that were ignored, and the culture of silence within the department. This isn't just about one bad officer. It's about an entire system that allowed him to thrive." Ethan nodded, his face set with determination. "We're not just fighting for Sophie," he said. "We're fighting for every family that's been silenced. And we're going to win." The stage was set for a courtroom battle that would determine not only Logan Price's fate, but also the future of a system that had long evaded accountability. The community, galvanized by Ethan's leadership and Clara's expertise, stood ready to fight for justice. For Ethan, the stakes couldn't be higher. Sophie's recovery, both physical and emotional, depended on the outcome. But beyond that, he knew this was about something far greater. The chance to create a world where no child would have to live in fear. The day of the first hearing dawned with a tense energy that seemed to ripple across the city. Outside the courthouse, a massive crowd had gathered, their signs and chants demanding justice for Sophie Daniels. The media presence was overwhelming, cameras poised to capture every moment of what had become one of the most high-profile cases of the year. Ethan Daniels arrived with Clara Knight and their legal team, their expressions resolute. As they passed through the crowd, Ethan paused briefly to acknowledge the supporters, offering a nod of gratitude before stepping inside. In the packed courtroom, the air was heavy with anticipation. Ethan sat at the plaintiff's table beside Clara, his demeanor calm but unyielding. Across the room, Officer Logan Price sat at the defense table, his posture rigid and his gaze fixed downward. He looked like a man weighed down by the consequences of his actions, though his defense team had coached him to maintain a stoic appearance. Bookmark. The room fell silent as the judge entered, the gavel striking once to signal the start of proceedings. Clara opened the case with a powerful statement, her voice firm and clear as she addressed the jury. "This case is about accountability," she began, her words slicing through the tension in the room. "It's about an 8-year-old girl, Sophie Daniels, who was robbed of her innocence and safety by a man who was sworn to protect her. But it's also about something bigger. A system that allowed Officer Logan Price to act with impunity despite years of warning signs." She gestured toward Ethan, who sat with his hands clasped tightly in front of him. Sophie's father, Judge Ethan Daniels, trusted this system to uphold justice. Instead, it failed him and his daughter in the most devastating way possible. Today, we seek not just justice for Sophie, but a reckoning with the failures that led to this tragedy. The jury listened intently, their expressions a mix of empathy and solemnity. Clara's words set the tone for what would be a grueling but critical fight. Logan's defense team countered with a narrative designed to elicit sympathy and justify his actions. "Law enforcement is a dangerous job," the lead defense attorney began, pacing in front of the jury. "Officers are often required to make split-second decisions in the face of uncertainty. Officer Logan Price made such a decision that day, not out of malice, but out of a genuine belief that he was acting to protect the community." The defense leaned heavily on the argument of instinct and protocol, framing Logan's actions as a tragic but understandable mistake. They painted a picture of a man under constant pressure, forced to make decisions in the heat of the moment. While the argument was carefully constructed, it began to unravel during cross-examination. Clara methodically dismantled their claims, focusing on Logan's history of complaints and his pattern of bias. "Officer Price," Clara began, her tone sharp, "would you agree that your role as a police officer required you to assess situations carefully before taking action?" Logan shifted uncomfortably. "Yes, that's part of the job." Clara held up a document. "This is one of several complaints filed against you over the past 5 years, alleging racial bias and excessive force. None of these were thoroughly investigated. Would you say that a history of such complaints reflects careful assessment?" Logan hesitated, his silence speaking louder than any answer he could have given. Clara's precision and determination began to sway the jury, exposing the cracks in the defense's narrative. The turning point came when Detective Maria Velasquez took the stand. Her testimony was a bombshell, revealing the culture of complicity within the police department. "I came forward because I believe in accountability," Maria began, her voice steady but laced with emotion. "For too long, we've ignored the warning signs, dismissed complaints, and allowed officers like Logan Price to operate without consequence. This case isn't just about one man, it's about a system that enabled him." Her words hung in the air, resonating deeply with the jury and spectators. Clara followed up with a series of questions that highlighted the systemic failures Maria had described. Detective Velasquez, Clara asked, in your experience, how often are complaints against officers thoroughly investigated? Maria shook her head. Rarely. Most are dismissed outright or buried under procedural delays. It's an unwritten rule: protect the badge at all costs. Her testimony was a critical blow to the defense, painting a picture of an institution more concerned with self-preservation than justice. Outside the courtroom, the protests reached a fever pitch. The chants of "Justice for Sophie" could be heard faintly even through the courthouse walls. Supporters held signs bearing Sophie's smiling face, a stark reminder of what was at stake. Ethan stood on the courthouse steps during a recess, addressing the crowd that had gathered. His voice carried over the noise, firm and impassioned. "This fight isn't just for my daughter. It's for every child and every family who has been let down by the system," he said, his words sparking cheers from the crowd. "Today, we're not just seeking justice for Sophie, we're demanding change." His speech galvanized the movement, further intensifying the pressure on the police department and city officials. The defense attempted to regain ground by calling a police trainer as an expert witness. The trainer testified about the challenges officers face and the split-second decisions required in high-pressure situations. "Officers are trained to act decisively," the trainer said. "In situations where there's even a perceived threat, hesitation can mean the difference between life and death." Clara, however, was prepared. During cross-examination, she focused on the specific circumstances of Sophie's case. "Would you say that a perceived threat justifies an officer drawing their weapon without first attempting to de-escalate the situation?" she asked pointedly. The trainer hesitated. "It depends on the context." Clara pressed further. "And in this context, a public park, an 8-year-old child with a kite, what threat could possibly justify opening fire without warning?" The trainer's silence was deafening, and Clara seized the moment to drive her point home. As the hearing progressed, it became clear that the scales were tipping in favor of Ethan and Clara's team. The combination of damning evidence, compelling testimony, and the public's unwavering support created a momentum that the defense struggled to counter. For Ethan, each small victory in the courtroom was a step closer to justice, not just for Sophie, but for everyone who had failed in the system. The first hearing ended with a sense of anticipation. The trial itself loomed ahead, promising to be even more intense and pivotal. But for now, Ethan and his team had taken a crucial step forward, and the tide was beginning to turn. The courtroom was silent as the trial entered its most crucial phase. Clara Knight stood before the jury, her presence commanding. This was the moment to present their most powerful evidence, testimonies, and documentation that would lay bare the failures of the police department and the actions of Officer Logan Price. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Clara began, holding up a folder filled with internal police reports, "what you are about to see is not just a case of one officer's poor decision. It is a pattern of negligence, bias, and willful ignorance by an institution that should be protecting its community." She handed copies of the reports to the judge and jury. These documents show that Officer Price had a history of complaints that were dismissed without investigation. They reveal a culture where accountability was not just lacking, it was actively avoided. Bookmark. The jury members flipped through the reports, their expressions growing grim. One report detailed an incident where Logan had used excessive force during a traffic stop. Another showed a citizen's formal complaint about racial bias, dismissed with a vague note citing insufficient evidence. Clara turned to Logan, who sat at the defense table, his face pale. "Officer Price," she said sharply, "how do you explain these complaints? Were all these people lying?" Logan avoided her gaze, his silence speaking volumes. The courtroom buzzed as Clara called her next witness, Detective Monica Ramirez. Dressed in a simple blazer, Monica walked to the stand, her expression resolute. She took an oath and faced the jury, her hands folded in her lap. "Detective Ramirez," Clara began, "how long have you been with the police department?" 14 years, Monica replied. "And in that time, how many cases of misconduct have you seen go unaddressed?" Monica hesitated, then answered firmly, "Too many to count." The culture within the department prioritizes protecting officers over holding them accountable. Complaints are ignored, evidence is buried, and officers like Logan Price are allowed to continue without consequence. Clara nodded, stepping closer to the witness stand. Can you explain why these complaints are so often dismissed? Monica's voice was steady. It's an unwritten rule. Protect the badge no matter what. Admitting fault is seen as a weakness, so the department sweeps issues under the rug to maintain its image. The jury hung on her every word, their expressions a mix of shock and anger. Clara allowed a moment of silence before continuing. And what about this case? Clara asked. What does this shooting say about the department's culture? Monica looked directly at Logan before turning back to the jury. It says the system failed. It failed Sophie Daniels. It failed her family, and it failed this community. The defense team scrambled to regain control. They called their own witnesses, including officers who testified about Logan's professionalism and the challenges of policing. They argued that while Logan's actions were regrettable, they were not malicious, but born out of a split-second decision in a high-pressure situation. But Clara was relentless during cross-examination. She focused on the inconsistencies in their testimonies and the lack of evidence supporting Logan's claims of perceiving a threat. Officer, you mentioned that Logan Price was highly trained, Clara said to one witness, a senior officer. Does that training include de-escalation tactics? Yes, the officer replied hesitantly. Then why weren't those tactics used in this case? Why was the first action to draw a weapon on an unarmed child? The officer faltered, unable to provide a convincing answer. Clara's relentless questioning chipped away at the defense's narrative, leaving the jury visibly unsettled. The most emotional moment came when Ethan Daniels took the stand. The courtroom fell silent as he adjusted the microphone, his presence commanding yet vulnerable. My daughter Sophie is not just a name on a case file, Ethan began, his voice steady but heavy with emotion. She is an 8-year-old girl who loves to fly kites, play with her friends, and dream about the future. On the day of the shooting, she wasn't doing anything wrong. She was being a child. Something she has every right to be. He paused, his eyes sweeping over the jury. But someone chose to see her as a threat instead of a child. That choice changed our lives forever. Ethan recounted the events of that day, his voice breaking only slightly as he described Sophie's pain and fear. He spoke about the sleepless nights, the countless hospital visits, and the emotional scars that would take far longer to heal than the physical ones. I've spent my career fighting for justice, Ethan said, his tone growing firmer. But this fight is personal. It's not just about Sophie. It's about ensuring that no other family has to go through what we did. It's about holding people accountable, no matter their position or title. The jury was visibly moved, some dabbing at their eyes as Ethan finished his testimony. Outside the courthouse, the movement continued to gain momentum. Protesters held vigils and marches, their voices amplified by social media and news coverage. Celebrities, activists, and political leaders lent their support, turning the case into a national rallying cry for systemic reform. Among the crowd was Danielle Torres, the activist who had been a constant presence since the shooting. She spoke passionately to a local reporter about the broader implications of the case. This isn't just about Sophie Daniels, Danielle said. It's about every child who's been treated unfairly, every parent who's been ignored, and every community that's been marginalized. We're not just asking for justice, we're demanding change. Back in the courtroom, Clara delivered a closing argument that tied all the evidence together. This case is not just about one moment of recklessness, she said, her voice echoing in the silent room. It's about years of negligence, bias, and a failure to hold those in power accountable. Officer Logan Price made a choice driven by prejudice and poor judgment. But this isn't just his failure. It's the failure of a system that allowed him to remain in uniform despite repeated warnings. She turned to the jury, her gaze steady. You have the power to send a message that no one is above accountability, that every life matters, and that justice will prevail. Sophie Daniels deserves that. We all do. The jury's faces were grim as they absorbed her words. The weight of their decision was clear. As the trial neared its conclusion, Ethan stood on the courthouse steps once more, addressing the crowd that had gathered. This fight isn't over, he said, his voice resolute. But today we have shown that the truth cannot be silenced. Together we will create a future where justice is not a privilege, but a right for everyone. The crowd erupted in cheers, their voices a testament to the power of unity and determination. The courtroom was heavy with anticipation as the jury filed back into their seats. Ethan Daniels sat at the plaintiff's table, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. Beside him, Clara Knight exuded quiet confidence, though even she couldn't deny the tension in the room. Across the aisle, Logan Price sat at the defense table, his face pale, his once straight posture now slumped under the weight of the trial. "Will the foreperson please stand?" the judge intoned, the room holding its collective breath. A woman in her 40s, the jury foreperson, rose, holding a piece of paper. Her voice was steady as she read. "In the case of Daniels versus Price and the Metropolitan Police Department, we, the jury, find the defendant, Officer Logan Price, guilty of gross negligence and a violation of Sophie Daniels' civil rights." A collective exhale swept through the room. Murmurs of relief and quiet applause rippled from the gallery. Ethan closed his eyes, a surge of emotion rushing over him. Clara placed a reassuring hand on his arm, acknowledging the monumental victory. Logan remained motionless, his face a mask of resignation. His defense team whispered hurriedly to him, but their words seemed to fall on deaf ears. The judge continued, outlining the penalties and the steps that would follow. It was clear that Logan's actions had not only led to personal consequences, but had also triggered a broader examination of the police department's practices. Outside the courthouse, the atmosphere was electric. Word of the verdict spread quickly through the crowd of protesters, sparking cheers and chants of justice for Sophie. Signs bearing her name and image were held high, a symbol of resilience and hope. Ethan stepped out onto the courthouse steps, greeted by an outpouring of support. The sea of faces that looked up at him reflected a shared sense of triumph. He raised a hand, calling for quiet before addressing the crowd. "Today, justice was served," he began, his voice strong but tinged with emotion. "But this is just the beginning. The fight doesn't end here. We must continue to demand accountability and challenge the systems that allow prejudice and negligence to thrive. We owe it to Sophie, to every child, and to every family who has been wronged." The crowd erupted in applause, their chants carrying his message far beyond the courthouse steps. In the days following the verdict, the impact of the trial reverberated across the city and the nation. The police department faced mounting pressure to reform its policies and practices. Internal investigations were launched, and several senior officials were forced to resign. Detective Monica Ramirez, who had risked her career to expose the department's failures, found herself hailed as a hero. "This isn't about me," she told reporters during a press conference. "It's about breaking a cycle that has gone unchecked for far too long. We need a system that values accountability over image, justice over convenience." Clara Knight, too, became a prominent voice for reform. She appeared on national news programs, using the momentum of the case to push for systemic changes. "This verdict was a victory," she said during one interview, "but it's just one step in a much larger journey. Real justice requires systemic change, not just individual accountability." Logan Price, once a respected officer, now faced a prison sentence and the loss of his career. His house, which had been surrounded by protesters for weeks, was now eerily quiet. The isolation was complete. Even his closest allies had distanced themselves. Sitting alone in a stark interrogation room for a follow-up interview, Logan struggled to articulate his thoughts. "I thought I was doing my job," he mumbled, his voice hollow. "I thought I was protecting people." The interviewer's response was sharp. "Protecting who? From an unarmed 8-year-old girl?" Logan had no answer. The silence was damning, a testament to the deep flaws in both his actions and the system that had trained him. Back at the Daniels household, life slowly began to return to a semblance of normalcy. Sophie, though physically healing, was still working through the emotional scars. Loud noises made her flinch, and she often woke up from nightmares, her small frame trembling as Ethan held her close. "You're so brave, Sophie," Ethan whispered one night as she clung to him. "And I promise I'll keep fighting to make the world safer for you and everyone else." Sophie nodded, her resilience shining through even in her vulnerable moments. "Will we win, Daddy?" she asked softly. Ethan smiled gently. "We already have, sweetheart, and we'll keep winning, one step at a time." The case had sparked a national movement, with marches and rallies held across the country to demand justice and reform. Activists worked tirelessly to keep the momentum alive, ensuring that Sophie's story would not fade into obscurity. At one such rally, Danielle Torres, the young activist who had been a constant presence since the shooting, delivered a powerful speech. "This movement isn't just about Sophie Daniels," Danielle declared to the crowd. "It's about every life lost or harmed by a system that refuses to change. It's about ensuring that justice isn't just a word. It's a reality for everyone." Her words resonated deeply, igniting a renewed sense of purpose among the attendees. Ethan, now a symbol of the fight for justice, used his platform to advocate for systemic reform. He worked with civil rights organizations, policymakers, and community leaders to push for changes in police training, accountability measures, and oversight. During a televised interview, Ethan reflected on the journey. "This fight has been one of the hardest of my life," he admitted, "but it's also been one of the most important. Sophie's story is a reminder of what's at stake, and I won't stop until we create a world where no parent has to fear for their child's safety." Though the road to healing was long, the Daniels family found solace in the support of their community. One sunny afternoon, Sophie stood in the backyard, her legs still wrapped in a brace, but her spirit shining through as she held the string of a new kite. Ethan watched from the porch, a sense of peace washing over him as he saw her smile again. The bright yellow kite soared into the sky, its tail dancing in the breeze, a symbol of resilience, hope, and the fight for a better future. Months had passed since the verdict, but the impact of Sophie Daniels' case continued to ripple through the community and beyond. Her story had become a rallying cry for justice, sparking conversations about systemic change and the responsibilities of those in power. Ethan Daniels sat in his home office, surrounded by stacks of legal documents, policy proposals, and letters of support from people across the nation. Though his heart was still heavy with the memory of that day in the park, he found solace in knowing that Sophie's pain had not been in vain. Clara Knight entered the room, carrying a cup of coffee and a thick binder. She placed it on Ethan's desk, her expression a mixture of exhaustion and determination. "This is the draft for the police reform bill," she said. "If we can get this passed, it'll set a precedent for accountability nationwide." Ethan flipped through the pages, his lawyer's eye catching every detail. The bill proposed stricter oversight for police departments, mandatory de-escalation training, and independent reviews of misconduct complaints. It was ambitious, but Ethan knew it was necessary. "This is good," he said, nodding. "It's what we've been fighting for." Clara smiled faintly. "We've come a long way, Ethan, but the work's just beginning." Meanwhile, Sophie was finding her own way to heal. Though the physical therapy sessions were grueling, she faced them with the same determination that had carried her through the trial. Her therapist often marveled at her resilience, describing her as a force of nature. One afternoon, Ethan watched proudly as Sophie took her first unassisted steps since the shooting. She wobbled slightly but quickly regained her balance, her face lighting up with triumph. "You did it, Sophie!" Ethan exclaimed, rushing to hug her. Sophie grinned, her eyes sparkling with determination. "I told you I'd get better, Daddy, and now I'm going to run faster than ever." Ethan laughed, his heart swelling with pride and relief. For the first time in months, he felt like their lives were truly moving forward. The Daniels family wasn't alone in their journey. The community that had rallied behind them during the trial continued to offer support. Neighbors brought meals, friends visited regularly, and strangers sent messages of encouragement. At a community event organized in Sophie's honor, Ethan stood before a crowd of supporters, his voice steady as he addressed them. "Sophie's story is not just ours, it's yours too," he said. "It's a testament to what we can achieve when we come together and refuse to let injustice prevail. This fight has shown me that change is possible, but only if we keep pushing for it." The crowd erupted in applause, their cheers a reminder of the collective power they had harnessed. For Logan Price, life after the trial was starkly different. Stripped of his badge and facing a prison sentence, he had become a symbol of the consequences of unchecked bias and negligence. Alone in his small apartment, Logan spent his days reflecting on his actions and the choices that had led him there. He had once believed he was protecting the community, but now he saw the damage his actions had caused, not just to Sophie, but to the trust and safety of those he had sworn to serve. One day, Logan received a letter in the mail. It was from an anonymous sender, containing a simple but pointed message: change begins with accountability. Use this time to reflect and rebuild. For the first time, Logan considered what accountability truly meant. Though the road ahead was uncertain, he resolved to confront the prejudices and assumptions that had shaped his life. Back in the city, the police department faced an overhaul. Under intense public pressure, new leadership was appointed and several policies were reformed. Complaints against officers were now reviewed by an independent civilian board, and transparency became a priority. Detective Monica Ramirez played a key role in these changes. Her bravery during the trial inspired others to speak out. "This isn't just about one case," Monica said during a press conference. "It's about building trust and creating a system that truly serves and protects everyone." Her words resonated deeply, marking a new chapter for the department and the community it served. As the months turned into a year, Ethan and Sophie found a new rhythm in their lives. While the memories of the past lingered, they chose to focus on the future. One bright spring morning, Ethan and Sophie returned to the park where the incident had occurred. The sun was shining, and the familiar sounds of laughter and birdsong filled the air. Sophie held the string of a new kite, a vibrant yellow one with a long tail that fluttered in the breeze. She looked up at her father, her face filled with determination. "Ready, Daddy?" she asked. Ethan smiled, nodding. "Go for it, kiddo." Sophie ran across the field, the kite soaring higher with each step. Ethan watched her, his heart swelling with a mix of pride and hope. As the kite danced in the sky, it seemed to carry with it all the pain, fear, and struggle of the past year, transforming them into something lighter, something hopeful. Ethan sat on a nearby bench, the sunlight warming his face. He opened a notebook and began jotting down ideas for his next project, a series of essays about justice, resilience, and the power of community. He paused, looking up at Sophie as she laughed and chased the kite. At that moment, he felt a profound sense of peace. The story of Sophie Daniels became more than just a headline. It became a catalyst for change. Across the nation, people were inspired to take action, to challenge systems of inequality, and to advocate for a better future. For Ethan and Sophie, their journey was far from over, but they faced it with renewed strength and unity. Together, they had turned a tragedy into a movement, proving that even in the darkest moments, hope could prevail. And as Sophie's kite soared higher and higher, it seemed to whisper a simple but powerful truth: the future belongs to those who dare to fight for it. The story of Sophie Daniels is more than just a tale of tragedy and justice. It's a mirror reflecting the flaws in our systems and the power of resilience in the face of adversity. Through the determination of her father, Ethan Daniels, and the unwavering support of a community united by compassion, this narrative sheds light on the importance of accountability and systemic reform. Sophie's journey reminds us that the pursuit of justice is often long and arduous but deeply necessary. Her innocence, shattered by an act of prejudice, became the spark for meaningful change. Ethan's fight against an entrenched system demonstrates the strength of a parent's love and the power of collective action. This story also highlights the courage it takes to stand against wrongdoing. From Detective Monica Ramirez exposing internal corruption to Clara Knight leading a legal battle with relentless dedication, these individuals remind us that change begins with those willing to challenge the status quo. Most importantly, Sophie's recovery and return to joy symbolize the resilience of the human spirit. Despite the pain and injustice, she found her way back to laughter and hope, teaching us that even in the darkest moments, healing is possible. The lessons of this story are clear. We must confront prejudice wherever it exists, demand accountability from those in power, and work together to build a world where every child can grow up without fear. If this story moves you, we want to hear your thoughts. Was it inspiring? If you thought the story was good, comment with a 1. If you thought it was amazing, comment with a 2. And let us know about your own stories of resilience and justice. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you won't miss the next powerful story we share. Share your reflections on this tale in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you.